In this lecture, I want to talk about command line arguments. The reason I included this information in the variables and data types section is because command line arguments are a way to pass data into your program. So it's sort of like passing a variable into your program, and it's very useful and you often do it. So I wanted to cover this real quick. So command line arguments. Basically, there are times when a program is developed that requires the user to enter a small amount of information at the terminal. Okay, so just like this implies, command line arguments are essentially program arguments. It's how you can pass data to a program. So when you ask a user or a program needs data that's dynamic, that's entered by the user, there's a number of different ways you can pass this data in. You can either ask the user for it, or you can pass it as a program, right? And the reason you'd want to do this is because, again, you might need the user to enter a number that indicates the triangular number that you want to have calculated. Or the user has to enter a word that you want to look up in a dictionary. Not all data is static or doesn't change. Some data you need to ask the user to input. And so, like I said, you could do this one of two ways. You can either request the data from the user, and we're going to talk about that in upcoming lectures, or you can supply the information to the program at the time the program is executed. And this is what is referred to as command line arguments. Passing data to your program via the command line when the program is run. And so we already know that every C program has a main function. This is a special function. It's basically the entry point of the program. It's also special because it can be used to get command line arguments. So when the main is called by the runtime systems, two arguments are actually passed to this function. Command line arguments. The two arguments are, the first one is the argument count. How much data is being passed to the program. It's an integer value. It specifies the number of arguments typed at the command line. The second argument, which is represented by argv for argument vector, is an array of character pointers. Now you may ask yourself, what's an array? We don't know what an array is yet, but again, it's important to understand how you can pass in command line arguments. You can just think of an array as many different variables for now. So first argument, argc for the argument count. Second argument is a vector. Remember, arguments are how you can pass in data to a function. That's all it is. It's really not even that complicated. So the main function, you can pass the main function some data when you run the program. That data can be specified when you run the program at the command line. So remember, when you run a program, you either double click on it if it's an executable, or if you're on Linux or Windows, you run it by doing a ./a.out. Well, when you do that, you can actually pass in things after the program. So you could say program.exe and then put parameters after that, data after that. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So again, the first entry in the array is a pointer to the name of the program that is executing. And then everything after that would be the arguments, and I'll demonstrate this. So here's an example. This is the main function, and it has two arguments, or two parameters, really. We'll talk about the difference between parameters and arguments as well. But you see it says int argc and then char, and there's a star asterisk argv. Again, don't worry about that. Basically, everything after the comma would be some data that you're passing to the program. And the argc would be the number of the data. All right, so let's go through an example. That's the best way to learn this. Okay, so here's our example. If we want to pass in data to our program via the command line, we have to have parameters in our main. Up until this point, main has just been empty with two empty parentheses. So the first thing we have to do is just have to say argc. Argc, it can actually be any name, but argc represents the argument counts. And then char star argv. And again, don't worry about this syntax for now. But we do have to add those two first. And so I'm going to create some variables here that demonstrate data being passed. And so because the data is being passed, I need to store it somewhere. So I'm going to create a variable of type int, just that is number of arguments. And this is going to be equal to argc. Argc is just the variable that's passed in. And I'll show you what this represents. I'm going to create another variable that just represents our argument. And this is going to be equal to argv0. Again, don't worry about the argv0 syntax. What this line of code is doing on line 13 is it's setting argument 1 variable equal to the program name. And then if we do another one, we say character star argument 2, and we're going to set that equal to argv sub 1. And then we're just going to print out this data. So we're going to say print out number of arguments, and we want to print out the value of a variable, so we have to use this format specifier. We're going to say %d, and then after the comma, we're going to say number of arguments, because this is the variable that we want to display. And then we have another print statement that's going to print out argument 1. And this is going to represent the program name. And again, we have to have a % symbol, so we're going to say %s because this is a string. Again, not important to understand at this point. We just, oftentimes, when you demonstrate code examples, you want to print out the value of variables. And so these printf statements on 16 and 17 are printing out the value of the variables that are passed to main, which are command line arguments. That's why I'm displaying it. And then the last one I want to display is our second argument. And this is the command line argument, in addition to the program name. So, and this would be argument 2 that we're going to display. And then we're going to return 0. So it's a very simple program in terms of it doesn't have a lot of functionality. It just basically gets data from the function that's passed in and displays that data. So when I said you can pass data to a program, again, remember that when you execute this program, we're just double-clicking on a menu option. But what's really going on is you're executing a command. Either double-click or executing exe, or in Linux or Unix, you're doing a.out. And so when you execute the program, you can actually pass data to it. Right? So since we're not actually executing the command, we're doing the menu, we have to pass the data via the integrated development environment. And luckily, CodeBlocks has a nice way of doing that. To pass data as a command line argument to a program, all you have to do is go to your project, highlight it, go up to the menu option that says project, and then go to set programs arguments. And see here, a window will pop up, and here basically you can just say your arguments. And you can put in as many as you want in here. Let's start, I'm just going to print my name, Jason. I'm going to pass that argument, that data, into my program when the program is run. And I'm going to say OK. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this. And when I run it, what do you think the value of number of arguments is going to be? Well, remember that there's one argument that's passed, which is the program name, and then I'm passing in Jason. So this should be equal to 2, the number 2. Argument 1 is going to be the program name, so this should be the program name, whatever I named it. And I can't remember if this will generate a test or not. And then argument 2 should be Jason, because that's what I am passing in. So now if I run it, let's see what happens. We say run. And my stupid virus protector, you'll see that number of arguments is 2. Argument 1 is the program name, which is, and it's very hard to read the format because there's no new lines. So let's start this over and actually add some new lines. How can we add new lines to be printed? We can just use an escape sequence, which is a \n. So let's add a \n after the %d for the first print statement and a \n after the next one. So it's more readable as output. And now let's save that. Let's build it again. And let's run it and see what the output is this time. Hopefully it'll be easier to read. Now when we execute it, you'll see that there's separate lines. Much easier to read. Number of arguments gets displayed as 2. Because as I mentioned, the first argument is the program name. The second argument is what I passed in. And argument 1 is actually displayed as the name of the program, which is my entire directory structure, and then test.exe. And argument 2 is Jason, because that's what I set in the IDE. Now, I can go and I can modify the program arguments by going to the project menu option and saying, make sure project, go to set program arguments, and I can change this. Now, when I change this, if I change it to something else, or I'll just say something. Now when I run it, the data that's going to be passed to the program is going to be something different. It's going to be, and actually all you have to do is run it. You don't even have to recompile. Now it's just something that's displayed. And so this is a way that you can pass data to a program without asking for it from the user specifically. You just type it in the IDE and pass it to the program. And you can pass many, many arguments. You don't just have to pass that one. If you wanted to pass more, you would just, again, go to set program arguments and either separate it by new lines. Of course, if you wanted to use them, you would have to access them in the array, but you can pass in many. Okay, so this is useful to pass data to a program without asking the user to type something in the keyboard. If you didn't do it this way, the program would pause and it would say, hey, user, please enter something. And then the user would enter something, and then you'd have to save it in a variable, and then you'd have to continue executing. This way, you don't have to ask the user for anything. You just pass it in as part of the program. So this is what command line arguments are. Don't worry about these other concepts like arrays. You see the asterisk for pointers. Don't worry about that. Again, this is just displaying the command line arguments.